Welcome to this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. Today we're going to start talking about fly control. Did you know that horned flies are the most economically important insect when it comes to cattle? Sometimes we can see instances where there's as many as 10,000 flies per animal. Something like that can cause major issues with blood loss, annoyance. It can also cause instances of summer mastitis in your cows. It can cause losses in weight gain in both weaning calves, up to 18 pounds, and even 50 pounds in stocker calves. So it's really important that we get our flies under control and we manage those effectively.
So as we get started, the first fly we're going to talk about today is the horned fly. This is a major problem in cattle. We see these mostly in the spring and the fall when they really start to peak. They feed on cattle's blood and their eggs are laid in fresh manure. These flies have about a 9 to 12 day life cycle and live about 6 to 8 weeks old as an adult. We have this problem because they overwinter in the soil, and that's when we start to see them emerge in the spring. As the summer gets hotter and drier, we may start to see a decline in these horned flies, but when fall gets here and it gets humid again and those temperatures start to decrease, we'll start to see these horned flies come back. So it's important to have a plan on how you're going to control these when they do. The next fly we'll talk about today is the face fly. It can cause lots of problems with decreased weight gain and even pink eye. Lots of times it's an annoyance for the cow, so it causes it to do things like not to eat. We don't see these nearly as common, but we do start to see them this time of year through late August. And they're going to be right there on the face, just like their name suggests. They feed on those secretions that come from their eyes, their nose, and if there's a wound on the cow, you'll see them congregate there. These flies like to overwinter in places like barns and walls. They have an 11 to 17 day life cycle, and they also have eggs that are laid in fresh manure. So when we talk about control options, that becomes really important. So then the question gets asked of when do you treat? There's acceptable thresholds because we're going to have flies. You'll never get rid of them completely. But having an idea of knowing when to treat is really important. With horned flies, you're looking at about 150 to 200 flies per animal is when we want to consider it's time to treat. And when you're trying to do a fly count, obviously that's not the easiest thing in the world to do. And so lots of times we count the flies that are on one side of an animal, double that number, and then you know if you're at that threshold you need to be at. With face flies, it's a little bit easier because at 10 flies per animal, we need to consider treating. I really like this graphic because it gives you an idea of how to kind of eyeball and get an idea of how many flies that cow really has on them. When we look at the cow that only has 50, they're going to be up through their withers. There are going to be a few sprinkled around their head and their legs, but they're not very thick. Whereas when we get over to 100, the withers are starting to be covered up more. We're seeing more on the face. We're seeing more on the legs. When you get to 200, not only is it covering the withers, they're working their way down the withers towards the shoulder, they're covering their head, they're covering their legs, and we're seeing flies on their belly. If we get to that point, we definitely are at that threshold that we need to start treating. So what to treat with? And we get this question a lot, and the answer is there's lots of options, and you've got to find the system that works well for your operation. You're considering things like managing resistance, so you're rotating through different chemical classes, which is incredibly important. And you're doing something that works for you and your facilities and your cattle. There's ear tag options. In the dairy industry, some of the folks that are trying to do organic really like these trap setups. There's self-treatment methods, there are feed-throughs or even dust bags. There's pour-ons, which I think are one of the most common. Those and ear tags are probably the two most common things I see in our county. And there's even some spray options that can get pretty fancy. Ear tags are pretty common because they're pretty easy to use. The handy thing about ear tags is lots of times you can get away with one treatment if you can time it correctly and those flies aren't insect intolerant. We want to wait to use these flies until you've got about 100 to 250 flies per animal. That way they're getting the most effect. These can provide anywhere from 12 to 20 weeks worth of control, so getting away within one season is absolutely doable. One of the biggest things when it comes to ear tags is to make sure you're managing resistance problems. And to do that, we want to rotate through each of the three classes so that those flies don't build a resistance, and now you have flies that you can't control. We want to recommend rotating every year, at least every 2. Don't ever use an ear tag more than 2 years in a row of the same chemical class. So when we look at chemical classes, you've really got 3 main options. You've got the organophosphates, the synthetic pyrethroids, and the macrolide lactones. And depending on which one you want to use, you have options to rotate. I would highly recommend rotating every year to make sure you keep that resistance level low. Another really common method that's used is pour-ons. You've got lots of pour-on options. There's pyrethroids versus endoinsecticides. Your pyrethroids are your ones that are strictly fly control, whereas your insecticides are the ones that have that wormer option built into it that we've talked about before. There's things like Ivamex, Cydectin, and lots of other wormers that are designed as a pour-on because they also have that external parasite control, and they can be really handy. Horn flies are a little harder to control, so make sure if this is the option that you're using, that you're monitoring that closely. And none of these are labeled to control face flies as well. So keep an eye out for the product that you're using. Make sure you're reading the label. Ivamex Pour-On gives you a little bit better control on horse flies for at least a few weeks, but you may have to apply that multiple times throughout the season, so be prepared for that as well. When it comes to pour-ons, the one thing that's handy is they all have this measurement guide on the side, or you use a gun that also has that measurement guide. So it's important to know the weight of that cow so that you know you're giving her the proper dosage as well. It's also handy with a pour-on because you know that that cow is getting that dose, just like with those ear tags, you know that ear tag is in that cow and you know how much each cow is getting treated with. When you're looking at other product options that aren't the insecticides, there's several others. This is an example of Ultrabros. It's a permethrin. These are pour-ons that are just labeled for that fly control. Sometimes they also cover lice or ticks or things like that, but it's all ectoparasites. This can be really handy, especially if you don't want to keep worming your cows as often. It can be a great option to go with. Several of these products are also labeled for face flies, which is another plus to going with something that's labeled for exactly what you're trying to do, so that we're not building resistance within our parasites that we don't want to build.
You've got this, you're just going to squeeze it, and it's going to fill up to the points you want to fill up. We're going to say she's a 900-pound cow. So once it's ready, we're going to start at the withers, which is that point up here between the shoulders. And we're going to pour all the way down her midline to her tail head and make sure we get everything back out.
There's also some spray options. This can be a good option to treat adult flies. The biggest thing is you want high pressure and large volume if you're wanting to spray big areas, or if it's a forced area like this one you can see is going through a gate that those cows have to walk to get through their feed bunks, you can spray your lower volume because the cows have to walk through it. This specific example is solar powered, which is really nice. And this restricts their access to something like water or mineral. There's an electronic eye that triggers it to go off. And it can be really effective as long as that fly population is at the threshold you need to treat. You don't want this going all the time or it wouldn't be very cost effective. Another method that's tried and true, a lot of people really like these, are back rubbers and dust bags. Just like that spray, it needs to be somewhere that those cows are forced to walk through every day. It's a self-treatment method. The cows can treat themselves. Lots of times you'll see cows that really like these as back scratchers. That back rubber is saturated with a light oil that also contains that insecticide. Just like our ear tags, we want to make sure that we're using our different options and we're rotating through those classes so we don't build resistance. But I can't emphasize enough the importance of these, that your cows have to walk through them. And that's one of the things that's tough, is you don't know that every cow is getting the doses they need to control that fly problem. So make sure when you set this up that the cows have to walk through those back rubbers or dust bags every single day. And then we get to feed through fly control. This is a really easy method to use. We're putting out mineral anyway. There's lots of minerals that have the fly control built into them. You can also get feed that has the fly control built into them. When we talked about both face flies and horn flies, those larvae develop through manure. Well, by feeding this fly control through, it's going to kill those developing larvae before they're able to grow into adult flies. It can be really effective as long as you have a herd that's not exposed to cows that aren't treated. If you share a fence line with a neighbor and his cows aren't using a fly control mineral or a feed through, those flies are just going to fly over your fence just like anything else. And you might be wasting the extra money on this fly control product if your cows aren't quarantined off to themselves. The other aspect of this is every cow needs to eat enough of it every day to have that control that you want within your herd. And sometimes it's hard to monitor to make sure that everybody has access to it. One thing to take into consideration is go ahead and look at your label and see what it's labeled of how much every cow is supposed to have. And as you're feeding it, make sure they're going through the amount they're supposed to be going through every day. That'll help ensure that you're getting the kind of control that you want to get by using this. For more information on horn flies, we have a great fact sheet that can be found on our website. We've also got another fact sheet that talks about some organic control methods that are especially used around dairy farms. And as always, don't hesitate to give us a call if you've got more questions.
Thank you for joining us for this week's session of Fridays on the Farm. Next week, we're going to continue our talk about flies and add some other external parasites and include ticks. We'll see you next Friday.